Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. I think it's just about okay to still be saying Happy New Year at this point, and we've got a very special programme to start 2023 because we're going to be bringing you the exclusive first look at a special Sky News investigation into the money that MPs get from donations, gifts and outside earnings that's been 10 months in the making. It shines a light on money in Westminster and poses important questions about influence in our politics. And we'll also bring you an exclusive interview with a man that all the polls say will be the next Prime Minister of this country. So in just a moment, we're going to bring you that exclusive report. And then we'll speak live to the man who wants to be the next Prime Minister. And if the polls are correct, he will be. That is the Labour leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. With the NHS facing unprecedented challenges from nurse and doctor strikes to huge backlogs and emergency care seemingly on the brink of collapse. For the government, we'll be joined by Health Minister and nurse herself, Maria Caulfield. And we'll try and find out just how bad things really are on the front line of the NHS with the President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, Dr. Adrian Boyle, who met the Prime Minister at number 10 just yesterday. Now, for generations, MPs have wrestled with the relationship between money and politics. There's been scandals over lobbying and cash for questions, calls for a ban on second jobs, but no agreement on what to do. But today, Sky News can reveal for the first time just how much extra money is still flowing into Westminster, who it goes to and where it comes from. In a major project with Tortoise Media, we compiled a comprehensive database that shows how much MPs really earn, the value of the gifts they're given, and the full scale of donations to individuals and also political parties. The Westminster Accounts draws together information from several public sources and for the first time makes it all available to the public in one place. So over the course of this week, we're going to have special reports built on what the database now reveals, including just how much MPs take home. And it also shows that since the last election, that was in 2019, they've earned £17.1 million on top of their regular salaries, with around 2/3 of that money going to just 20 MPs. Now, all of this work, it should be said, is legal. Most of the biggest earners are Conservatives, led by 2 former Prime Ministers. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has this exclusive report.
Who funds our politics and our politicians? It's a question that's hung over Westminster for generations.
Shouldn't MPs be banned from having second jobs?
Duck houses and moats. You couldn't make it up.
And one that's never been easy to answer.
Enough is enough.
We know the rules were broken.
Money and scandal have long been part of the fabric of our politics.
I wouldn't hesitate to do it again tomorrow.
But once they're over, the answer is always the same.
We are going to hold MPs to account.
We need a totally transparent system.
Promise after promise of transparency, but little real progress. Until now, as we open Westminster's accounts and make them accessible to everyone. Who is giving what to MPs? Which politicians earn the most? How does business try and get its way? We took data from Parliament records, the Register of Members' Financial Interests and the Electoral Commission to present a fuller picture than ever before of outside earnings or second jobs, gifts and donations to MPs, as well as donations to political parties.
For decades, all of this information was clouded in opaque language and filed away in dusty tomes in shelves in Westminster. Sky News and our partners, Tortoise Media, have been working to change that so we can all follow the flow of money through our political system, now turning thousands of confusing written entries into a database available at the touch of a button, allowing us to tell stories like we never could before. Like this. Over £17 million. That's the total amount of outside earnings that MPs have declared in the course of this Parliament, just 3 years, and is on top of their annual £84,000 salary. And this might be one reason why reform is so hard when a Tory government's in number 10. Of the 17 million, £15 million in earnings made by MPs goes to Conservatives. Now, for the first time, we can sort MPs in order of what they make from second jobs and other outside earnings. This here is the leaderboard. These people, the top 20, made close to 2/3 of all the outside earnings in this parliament. Again, it's dominated by Conservatives. 17 of the top 20 are Tory MPs. The person at the top of this list is familiar to everyone. It's former Prime Minister Theresa May, declaring over £2.5 million. Life post number 10 appears to have been treating her well.
Either my right honourable friend had not read the rules, or didn't understand what they meant, and others around him, or they didn't think the rules applied to number 10. Which was it?
This is what the former Prime Minister wants you to see. Out of office, but still upholding standards and holding her successors to account. But away from the Commons, a packed and lucrative schedule. Since leaving number 10, Mrs May has earned 10 times her MP's salary, giving dozens of speeches to a host of different audiences, from American banks to the Danish legal profession. £113,000 for a speech to a scientific conference, £136,000 for an address to the World Knowledge Forum. A former Prime Minister in huge demand, even in countries which she took on as Prime Minister. It was the murder of activist and journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 that made Theresa May a firm critic of Saudi Arabia.
I can update the House that no minister or official is attending the investment conference in Saudi Arabia. And
as well as demanding answers, she blocked her ministers from visiting the country for a conference.
Thank Lady Theresa May for her time and to thank the Kingdom for welcoming her. Thank you.
4 years on, and a very different approach, it seems.
The rich diversity of cultures, religions and beliefs.
The former PM on stage herself in the capital of Saudi Arabia at a travel conference, telling the audience it was a pleasure to be in Riyadh and being paid £107,000. For almost 2 months, Sky News has been trying to get Theresa May to talk about her outside earnings. Her office acknowledges receipt of our questions, but the promised reply never comes.
This is Theresa May's constituency office. We're just going to knock on the door.
We went on a Friday, when MPs are typically in their constituencies, to get answers that way. But no luck.
It is a shame that Theresa May isn't here, because she says that the money that she earns goes into this, a company called the Office of Theresa May Limited. Here are the accounts. And that she pays herself a salary of £85,000 a year from this company, and the rest of the cash goes to support her charitable work and to pay for other activities as a former Prime Minister. But looking at these accounts, it's just not quite clear how that works. The cash seems to come into this company, but it's not clear where it goes from there, and now we can't ask Theresa May what's going on.
We know Theresa May is involved in charitable work, but under this system, we just can't see how much or where the money goes. Her Maidenhead constituents willing to make up their mind without the answers.
Oh my God, that's a lot of money. Well, I think if she's more focused on doing that than being a constituent MP, certainly it would affect it. MPs should be doing their job and not getting involved in all these other things, you know?
Are you surprised people pay a lot of money to hear her speak?
Yeah, that's what I'm surprised about. Theresa May, she doesn't know what's happening in Maidenhead.
Some are more supportive.
It all depends what she's talking about. If somebody wants to pay money to her, who's to say why not?
It's not just the former Prime Minister who's been declaring she's earning big sums on top of her day job. Sir Geoffrey Cox is a second MP that has declared they topped £2 million already earned in this Parliament. His coming from legal work. He says his experience as a practising barrister is invaluable to politics, and he spends no more time than a cabinet minister would on their job. Flying up this leaderboard, another former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Since his resignation, he's become an earnings juggernaut. He walked out of number 10 in September and has already earned over £1 million. He's hit that total with his earnings from just 4 speeches. For a single speech in New York, he was paid at a rate of £32,500 per hour. That's more than the starting salary for a British nurse over a whole year, earned in just 60 minutes' work. Liz Truss still hundreds of places below both her predecessors. Her earnings total under £1,000, royalties for a decade-old book. Also, in the top 5, the former head of Margaret Thatcher's policy unit and former cabinet minister, John Redwood, making big money with a big job title. As well as being MP for Wokingham, he's the chief global strategist for the investment firm Charles Stanley, declaring earnings of nearly £700,000 from the company since the last election. Here, praising the growth of video conferencing because it means he can do more for the firm.
Someone who is obviously part-time, I think I'm far more efficient as a result of these changes because I can, for example, break off today and share a conference with you for an hour at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, whereas I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that if I had to travel an hour or 2 hours to get to a given venue or an office. So I can actually do more.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has been a busy man. He lists more sources of outside income than any other MP, receiving money from over 36 separate companies. Speaking to voters, yes, but declaring significant earnings at the same time.
David Lammy sits at Keir Starmer's top table, Shadow Foreign Secretary for over a year. One of the biggest jobs in the Shadow Cabinet at a time of international crisis. Mr. Lammy has juggled that role with a range of outside work, a radio show, speeches and training courses for corporations. A lengthy section on his personal website promotes his skills as a paid public speaker on a broad sweep of different topics.
We're certainly living in uncertain times.
From crisis management...
If America retreats from the world...
...to US politics. And companies have clearly been taking notice. David Lammy has listed at least 30 speaking and training engagements since December 2019, worth around £100,000, as well as more than £87,000 for a radio programme on LBC. All of this hard to square with the Labour leader's firm line against second jobs.
Ban all second jobs for MPs, with very limited exceptions.
Neither Keir Starmer's team nor David Lammy's were able or willing to set out if his outside work would qualify for an exemption from the ban.
I'm on a political show putting political views and putting the views of my constituents.
Mr. Lammy's office acknowledged receipt of our questions, but chose not to respond. Mr. Lammy has, however, made an impassioned defence of his second jobs on his radio show.
Why am I here? Why am I pleased to be here? Because, one, I'm the only black presenter on LBC. It's important for my constituents. I love the fact that they approach me and they can hear me putting views that they agree with out there into the public.
Some of his Tottenham constituents like having a visible local MP.
I think he's focused enough on the job of being a politician, yeah, and I think
You think he's focused enough on Tottenham, even though he's making all this money outside?
Well, yes, because he's accessible, which I think is, it can't be said of lots of others.
For some constituents, it's not the radio show that's the problem.
Deloitte, Lloyds of London, JP Morgan Chase, Canary Wharf Group, GSK, some of those are quite shocking to me. Ask why he did them, I guess, and, does he agree with the practices or the values of these companies? I think if that was brought up for me, it'd make me squirm a bit, probably, and rightly so.
All allowed under the rules, which permit MPs to do almost any second job apart from lobbying. MPs themselves often point out it's no different from being a cabinet minister. But this is an admission that, for some, being an MP is not necessarily a full-time occupation. coming up with a single easily comparable figure for outside earnings, unlikely to go down well with MPs who could have done it themselves.
There's no incentive for MPs really to make it easy to do the sort of comparison that you've done in this exercise. It's much easier for them to say, we've been transparent, the data is out there, people can go and look for it if they want to, but in fact that data isn't very easy to use and it's not real transparency.
MPs' earnings information is just one benefit of the new public tool Sky News has commissioned from Tortoise Media. More than 500,000 different pieces of data about your MP and all MPs now able to be explored by anyone. Tomorrow, we look at donations. More findings, more league tables, only possible because of the Westminster Accounts project. And these prompt the question, does what MPs tell us give us the whole picture?
We'll be hearing from Sam later in the programme. We'll also have more stories from the Westminster Accounts in the coming days. But now it's time for our first interview of the new year, and it's a big one. We can talk now to the man hoping to become the UK's next Prime Minister, Labour's Keir Starmer, and find out what he would do if he got the keys to number 10. Thanks very much for being on the programme.
Good morning. Very good to be your first interview of the year.
Good morning. Yeah, it's good to have you as well. I'm keen to get to your vision, to what you would do if you were the next Prime Minister. But first, I just want your reaction to the Westminster Accounts project. Whatever your views on, political donations or outside earnings, surely more transparency has got to be a good thing.
Transparency is a good thing. I think that you've obviously pulled together a lot of information there, made it publicly available. I think it was all in the public domain because it's all been declared according to... We've got strong rules, as you know. I think we've got some of the strongest rules in terms of what we have to declare. But, the more transparency, the better, so that everybody can see exactly what has been declared. And ask whatever questions they want to about it.
Yeah, and I think it's the accessibility. I mean, you can pull up whoever you want, your own entry. I guess you think it's important for your own top team to be transparent as well.
Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that everybody is declaring in accordance with the rules that have been in place for some time. What you've done is bring that all together in one place, but it's all been declared according to the rules.
Absolutely right. I think the thing that's interesting about the project, for me anyway, is that you can have a comparison as well. So you know what's usual in terms of earnings and what is perhaps not. And it is also fair to say that if you're looking at the highest earners, the vast majority are Conservative MPs, nearly all. Nearly. Just want to have a look. On November the 16th, 2021, you made a speech on how to improve parliamentary standards, and you said, these are the changes that Labour is calling for. First, a ban on all second jobs for MPs with very limited exceptions. And then 13 days after that speech, David Lammy becomes Foreign Secretary. You can have a look at his entry on our database. He's earned £106,000 since the 16th of November 2021, which is when you made the speech.
Yeah.
So how is that compatible with your ban on second jobs?
Well, Sophie, what I was proposing was a system for all MPs, that we should ban second jobs. There's a discussion about what exemptions there should be. I think David, for example, does a lot of media work, and I think media work and writing books is all part of the political process. But there's a discussion to be had. What I was urging was for the whole House of Commons to agree new rules, because I do think that we should get rid of second jobs, with some exceptions. Some people have jobs where they need to top up their skills. And I do think if you write a political book or,
as you have yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That may be grounds for an exemption. But what I still want, is for the whole House of Commons to agree new rules which are stricter than the rules that we've got. And the sooner we can do that, the better.
So you mentioned some exemptions. So in your view, then, making £90,000 from a weekly radio show, as David Lammy has, would be an exemption? Or how about tens of thousands from speeches to bankers, consultants, tech firms, as he has too?
I think Parliament's got to come together and decide what the exemptions should be. But I, for my part, think the rules should be stricter. I think
But you can't say which jobs should be banned and which shouldn't.
Well, broadly speaking, I think that there's a million miles of difference between someone who's advising a company on strategy, for example, and someone who's writing a political book. But look, I'm open to a discussion on this. I think the rules should be stricter. I would like the House of Commons to come together again and have another go at changing the rules. Obviously, when we said those things, that was in the middle of some terrible rule breaking that was going on in the House of Commons. Last year was a
you're talking about, yeah.
Last year was a busy year, but look, do I think the rules should be stricter? Yes, I do. Do I think it's very good that it's transparent? Yes, I do. Do I encourage the House to come together? Because in the end, it's not a party political matter. It's got to be the whole of the House of Commons. Do I want the House of Commons to come together to have another look at it? Yes. Then we can have a discussion about what the exemptions should be. The narrower, the better, in my view. But obviously, we've got to reach an agreement and go forward from there.
OK, thank you very much. You want to be the next Prime Minister. Right now, for many of our viewers, the number one priority is the health service.
Yes.
What is your plan?
Well, I think, firstly, we've got to acknowledge that the health service is not just on its knees, it's on its face. I think as we sit here today, there are 7.2 million people on the waiting list. Speak to anyone who works in the NHS and they'll tell you just how stressed it is. My wife works in the NHS, so I know this firsthand. So the NHS is on its face. There are immediate things that we have to do to get through this winter. But I think that bigger than that, we've got to have change and reform. We've got to make sure the NHS is sustainable, not just through this winter, but over the next 10 years. And that's why I've asked West Streeting to do our work on change and reform. And I want a 10-year plan for change and reform of the NHS. And that's what we would usher in as a Labour government, not just the sort of what I've called the sticking plaster politics of getting through the winter crisis, but actually fixing the underlying problems and changing the NHS. So, for example, I think we need much more preventative work. We need to intervene much more quickly. And I want to see health accessible in our communities. So there's big change. And I think it's for the Labour Party to do that. We set up the NHS and we will ensure the future of the NHS. But just at the moment, we've got a crisis. And it's the worst crisis we've ever had. And that's because we've had 13 years of neglect. And
worse than COVID, you think, then, the pressure currently?
Oh, if you look, I mean, of course, COVID put extra pressure on the NHS. Nobody would deny that, certainly not me, with my wife working in one of the big London hospitals. I know what stress that put us under. But the waiting lists were, 4.6 million before we went into COVID. The difficulties we've had with workforce has been there for a very, very long time. They've never been fixed by this government. So one of the first steps we would do, and we've already set out, is to get rid of the non-dom status, which allows very wealthy people not to pay their tax in this country. We'll get rid of that and use the money from that to double the number of medical students coming into the NHS. So that's the first practical step. But we've got to go much further than that. Change and reform is what is needed. We're going to consult on this in the course of the coming months, and then there'll be a 10-year plan for the NHS under the next Labour government.
You are doing the thing that some people are very frightened of doing, which is talk about private sector involvement as well. In your speech this week, you talked about the public and private sectors working in partnership. Yeah. There's been a move where you want to see more use of beds in the private sector. Just explain the thinking there.
Well, the immediate problem is obviously the waiting lists, and one of the issues that we've looked at is whether or not we're using the private sector effectively. A number of people do go as NHS patients to the private sector. Our research shows that that's been underused and we could do more of it. And that would clear, 230,000 people off the waiting list every year.
So more use of the private sector in the NHS under Labour?
Yes, but I mean, let me be clear. We're not talking about privatising the NHS. We're talking about using the private sector effectively. And free at the point of use is an absolutely governing principle as we go into this review. But we do need change and reform. I want to look, for example, at primary care. Would it be possible to use local pharmacies more to do work on prescriptions, etc.? Is there a route for self-referral? What do we do about, the partnerships of GPs, which I don't think are necessarily as efficient as they should be? We're asking all the questions that a bold incoming government should ask about change and reform. Now, we want to consult because obviously we need to test these ideas.
With the doctors' unions that it sounds like this could provoke. You're willing to have that battle?
Yeah, we've got to have battles. I mean, I ran a public service, the Crown Prosecution Service, for 5 years as part of the criminal justice system, and I've reformed that. And my experience of reform is there will always be people who say, I wouldn't do that, I'd keep it as it is, don't touch anything. I totally disregard that. I think if there's change to be made, we've got to get on and make it. Okay. So this isn't a battle with a particular sector, but it is a statement of intent. We need to change, we need to reform, we need to make sure the NHS can survive for decades to come, And that will mean change and reform, and we're not going to back down the first time somebody says, well, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't change this.
I just want to have a look at one of your 10 pledges during your leadership campaign to become the leader of the Labour Party. And you said this in it. You said, public services should be in public hands. Here we go. Public services should be in public hands, not making profits for shareholders. And this is the key bit, end outsourcing in our NHS. So why have you changed your mind?
Well, we're not talking about privatising the NHS
but we're talking about outsourcing.
Or any public... Well, the NHS has always used elements from the private sector. GPs, for an example, is an example.
But your
of
pledge,
that.
you said end outsourcing in our NHS. You've changed your mind?
Yeah, well, look, the outsourcing of some issues and functions I don't think has been very effective. But if you take the NHS has always used GPs in private practice. That's always been part of it. For many, many years, the NHS has referred NHS patients to the private sector to have operations, hip operations, knee operations, etc. I think we could be more effective at that. But I'm not talking about privatising the NHS. The same is true in criminal justice. I do think it should be run as a public service. But it doesn't mean there isn't a private sector in there. Self-employed barristers, for example, from the private sector, provide a service in criminal justice in relation to prosecutions. What I want to ensure is that our public services, which frankly are on their knees, I mean, ask yourself the question: is any public service now better than it was 13 years ago when this government came in? And I don't think anybody with a straight face could answer that question and say yes. They're better than they were. Nor could anyone, frankly, answer the question, do you feel personally better off over the last 13 years? Or is our economy better off? Almost all those questions beg only one answer, which is no.
I was quite interested earlier in the interview when we talked about the NHS, and you were saying about how your wife tells you stories about what's going on. What kind of thing did she say?
Well, probably what everybody working in the NHS said. I mean, my sister used to work in the NHS, my mum worked in the NHS, so I know a lot about it, and obviously a lot of people we know work in the NHS. But it's completely under strain. One of the big issues is workforce, and that's why it's very important that we made that commitment, end non-dom status, use that money to train up the next generation of medical staff.
And how about pay as well? Because people say pay is a big factor.
Yes,
We've got the strikes, of course, as well. The leader of the Royal College of Nurses suggested this last week that her members would accept a 10% pay rise. Would you agree to that?
Well, look, let me tell you the approach we would take, because I think many people...
We know you'd get around a table and negotiate, but what kind of pay rise would you agree
let me just
with?
walk through, and I'll obviously answer your question, don't worry about that, but just walk it through. The nurses have never, ever had a national strike before, ever. They don't want to be on strike. And it's a badge of shame that for the government that we're even in this situation. All they're asking for is the government to get in the room and negotiate with them. And they said that before the strike...
Well, they're asking for more money, aren't they?
Before the strike started, in that week before the strike started, they said, if the government comes into the room to talk to us, we won't go on strike. And the government has refused to do so. If we were in government, we would go in the room and discuss. We would have taken up that offer. So the hypothetical you're putting to me, what would you do if you were in government? Yes, we would roll up our sleeves, we would go in and we would talk to them and we'd resolve this issue. Just add two other bits to this. Firstly, there never was a national strike under the last Labour government. 13 years, no national strike.
I do want to get back to the question, which pay is key, isn't it?
Of course, pay is key.
Would you agree to a 10% pay rise for nurses?
There's going to have to be compromise on both sides. I'm not going to sit here answering a hypothetical about the situation. You're asking me what would I do in government. If I was in government, I'd go into the room and negotiate. But equally, Sophie...
That's what they're doing next week, isn't it?
If I was in government, I wouldn't come on your show and say in advance of that what percentage might be a compromise, what we would discuss, any more than the trade unions would. So I wouldn't expect the government to come on your show and say, this is the percentage. I would expect the government to come on your show and say, yes, we'll get in the room with the nurses and we'll bring this strike to an end. OK.
And now you made a big speech this week setting out your vision for the country. What's the most important message from it, do you think, that viewers should take away?
Oh, that we need hope and change. Okay. After 13 years of failure, we need hope and change. We need... a decade of national renewal, and that is what we will bring about. Growing the economy, restoring our public services, and making sure that people have much more of a say and influence over the decisions that affect them.
Now, in the speech, you appropriated the language of Brexit. You said that you were the man to take back control. So you said this, you said, "As I went around the country campaigning for Remain, I couldn't disagree with the basic case so many Leave voters made to me." So is that why you led the campaign for a second referendum? You said that you'd vote Remain in a second referendum, and you described the Leave vote as catastrophic for the UK. You said all that because you agreed with Leave voters.
Well, Sophie, what I said in my speech is something I've said actually many, many times. I've always I voted Remain. I'm not going to, and I campaigned for...
And then campaigned for a second referendum.
I voted for Remain. I campaigned for Remain.
And for a second referendum.
We lost the referendum. But deeper than that, beyond the technical question, should we be in the EU or not, I felt that bound up in that referendum was a big question about change. People desperately wanted change. That's why I think Take Back Control was such a powerful slogan in a way. It was a Heineken phrase. It got inside people. And if you can't make your household budget balance, you don't feel you've got control. If you don't feel that you can send your child to a school that is excellent in your area because there isn't a school that's excellent, you don't have control. If you feel that antisocial behaviour means you can't go out in your neighbourhood after dark, you don't have control. That powerful case for change, over and beyond the question of EU membership, was always that. I've always actually accepted that. I think most people who voted Remain would accept that as well.
Yeah, but I guess a lot of Leave voters, Leave voters will say, they voted Leave because they want to leave the EU. If you're honest,
I think there was more in that vote than yes, of course.
If you're honest, do you think you're shifting messages because the electorate that mattered to you at then was a pro-Remain party membership who'd be voting for the next Labour leader? The electorate that matters to you now, when you're promising to take back control, are those swing voters, many of them who voted for Brexit. Are you changing your message to suit your own purposes?
No, Sophie, I've long reflected on that 2016 referendum, as I've reflected on the Scottish referendum in 2014, where a large number of people voted yes. Of course, the technical question on the ballot paper was membership of the EU or, independence in Scotland. But sitting behind that, I think there was a very powerful emotional case for change, which I don't think most Remainers would argue with. I certainly didn't. I've always argued that the other side of Brexit is delivering the change that's needed in this country.
Well, let's talk about...
And that's what I was setting out in my speech just earlier this week.
Let's talk about some of the changes that people wanted. Immigration, a big part of the Take Back Control message for many people, and obviously a big political issue now with small boats and also record levels of immigration. So 1.1 million people arrived in the UK in the last year. Is that too low or too high?
Well, look, Sophie, I'm not going to get into a numbers game. We need fair rules, firmly applied, and we need to distinguish between the different reasons that people come to this country. Some people come to join their families. I think, broadly speaking, most people accept that that's perfectly all right. A number come as students, and I want the best students from across the world to come here. Some arrive as refugees, including from places like Afghanistan and Ukraine, and obviously we welcome them, as we always have done, and some come to work. Now, what I've said in a speech I did earlier, in fact, at the tail end of last year, is that when it comes to those coming to work, of course, we recognise and welcome the contribution that everybody who comes to this country makes. But what I've said to the CBI is we need to wean ourselves off this sense that rather than skill up and train people in this country, we can simply bring people in from other countries. I don't think that's right. I think that we can do far better on the skills in this country. So I think there's room for fair rules, for firmly applied, and for a national debate about what we want from immigration.
One of the reasons I'm keen to get your view on this is because it feels to me that you have shifted, I guess, on immigration, again, in the last few years. So in the leadership campaign, we can see on one side of the screen, one of your pledges was to defend free movement as we leave the EU, a leadership pledge in 2020. And then compare that to a Mail on Sunday interview. Freedom of movement is a red line for me. It won't come back under my government.
Let's just look at those.
These are diametrically opposed.
Of course they're not. Look, defend free movement as we leave the EU. Right, we've left. No, so now we've got to face the future we're in. We're out of the EU. Free movement has gone. So the question then comes, well, what do you want now? Do you want to go back, or do you want to have a different system with fair rules, etc.?
This is as we leave the EU.
Yeah, well,
but this is acknowledging that we're leaving the EU and saying that you'll be defending free movement as we leave.
But we've left. We've left. And therefore, free movement was part of the package for being a member of the EU, inevitably. We've left. Free movement has come to an end. Therefore, a different question arises, which is, what immigration system do you want now? And I think we should have a fair system with fair rules that are firmly applied. And that's what we would devise.
So it's nothing to do with the fact that in the leadership campaign you were pitching to pro-Remain Labour members, and now you're again looking at those swing voters, many of them who voted Brexit. If you don't like my principles, I have others. It's nothing to do with that.
I think so, here. I mean, it's obvious what that pledge was as we leave the EU. We've left the EU. We've got to face the future as it is. But I say this, the other thing that I said, we did lots and lots of speeches and hustings, materials in that leadership campaign. My overwhelming pitch to the Labour Party was, we have to win the next election, otherwise none of the things we're talking about are going to come to pass. And we've lost elections consistently since 2010. I'm determined that that won't happen again. And that's why I set myself, when I became leader of this party just under 3 years ago, 3 tasks. The first was to change the Labour Party. When you lose as badly as we did in 2019, you don't look at the electorate and say, what were you doing? You look at your party and say, we're going to change. And we've been really clear about the change that we've brought about within the party, whether that's anti-Semitism, whether that's NATO, whether that's our relationship with business. The second thing is we have to expose the government as not fit to govern. Well, you can see what 13 years of failure has done. The next stage is to lay out the alternative. We began to do that last year, and 2023 is this chance for us to set out what a bold, reforming Labour government will do.
Let's just have a look at a picture of you this week giving your speech. If I may, you looked pretty relaxed and confident when you gave the speech. You know, you had no jacket, you had your sleeves rolled up. You know, is that the look of a man who thinks he's going to be the next Prime Minister?
I hope so, yes. What I was doing there was setting out the case for 2023 for hope, for change, and the sort of bold change government. We need a decade of national renewal. And I think the next election is going to be about change. And, you know, if anybody asks themselves, am I better off than I was in 2010 when this government first came in? I think the answer will be no. Are our public services any better now than they were then? The answer will be no. The answer will be no. So we desperately need change. What I want to do is to set out that case for change, and not just what the change will be, but also how we're going to bring it about.
Looking ahead to 2023, are you going to have time to read the Prince Harry book?
I don't know. I haven't set aside time yet.
Are you sympathetic with him? Or?
Well, my governing principle is that politicians shouldn't wade into private matters of the royal family. I know
some private at the minute, right?
Well, but some politicians like to wade in and give opinions left, right and centre. I actually don't, and I think it's better not to wade in.
Maybe this one then. Is 2023 the year that Arsenal are going to win the Premier League?
I really hope so. We're so tight at the top. We've got to keep going. It's a fantastic squad, really good team of players there. We're in a very, very good position.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party. Well, that was the view from the opposition. Time now to get the view from the government, whether it's delays getting ambulances or the huge backlogs for care. For many people, the NHS is the #1 political issue right now. And tomorrow, the government's going to be meeting union leaders in a bid to try and avert further strike action in a health service that is already on the brink. While still doing shifts as a cancer nurse, Health Minister Maria Caulfield knows the NHS better than most. She joins us now. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm very keen to get on to the NHS, but first, if I may, I just want to get your reaction to the Westminster Accounts project, launched by Sky today, a transparency tool, effectively, for the money that is coming into politics. Do you welcome more transparency?
Well, I was an MP when the expenses scandal broke a number of years ago, and of course we all welcome the transparency. It is very clear we all have to declare any outside interests, any outside earnings, so people can go onto the Parliament website and look for themselves as well. But I think, you know, what was important during the expenses scandal was to try and end professional politicians just being the only route into being an MP. And so you are seeing people coming into Westminster with outside interests. I'm a nurse, I still work as a nurse, I declare those earnings on my website, and then, you know, cross-party, we have doctors who work in the Labour Party on our side and the Conservative Party. And I think it's important that people are able to keep their interests in that sort of field going. It certainly helps me in terms of my work as a local constituency MP, but also as a health minister to really see what's happening on the ground.
Well, let's bring up your own entry, shall we? Because you mentioned it yourself. We can see your entry on the database here, and we can look in a bit more detail at some of your own donations and earnings. The first thing, if we have a look, that stands out, as you mentioned, the £8,890 of earnings from the Royal Marsden Hospital. So that's your work as a nurse that you continue to do.
Yeah.
And I guess some would argue that's a good example of MPs having outside
Well,
earnings.
also, MPs like myself, politics is a fickle game. If you're not elected at the next election, then I would go back to working as a nurse, and you have to keep your registration. So sometimes there's a practical element to it. And actually, my constituents really were pleased to see me go back during COVID, back onto the wards and help out where I could.
And I guess it gives you a perspective on some of the issues as well.
Absolutely.
You can also see there at the bottom, £3,250 of gifts from the Betting and Gaming Council. What was that in relation?
So that was an event I went to. I went to Wimbledon, and a constituent invited me who happens to work for the Betting and Gaming Council. So, and that's what I mean. Transparency is there. My constituents can look on the website, the parliamentary website, and ask me, well, what is that about? You can see donations there that were for the last general election. Now, they come to the party, but if they're allocated to you, you have to declare them.
And you've got a swing seat as well, I guess.
You will be getting donations coming up to election time.
I just want to have a look at the bottom one a bit more, because we can also have a look at the total recipients for the Betting and Gaming Council, another feature on the website. You're one of around 30 MPs who receive gifts from them. Now, on their website, they say they represent betting shops, casinos, online and bingo. They work to, in their words, drive high ethical standards, create a culture of safer betting and gaming, and build public and institutional trust in our world-class industry. Now, as you say, all these gifts have been declared in the proper way, they're within the rules. But in your view, is it appropriate?
Well, my example is one from a constituent who works for them, so you have to declare that there's a vested interest there, and that is to make it open and transparent. I haven't actually been involved in any work with the Betting and Gaming Council, but that's the level of transparency that I have. Is there any connection at all? And as a minister, you also have to declare any interests too.
And then overall, on earnings, we found that MPs have earned £17.1 million today on top of their salary since the last election. And I have to say, that is overwhelmingly Conservative MPs. £15.4 million of that money from Conservative MPs. I mean, is that OK, in your opinion?
Well, I think when I was watching the report earlier, two of those are from former Prime Ministers, and former Prime Ministers do get paid for political speeches, so it's part of their political work. But I think the best judges of all of this will be constituents. And, if constituents don't feel that an MP is giving 100% to their constituency, they've got the ballot box to make that ultimate decision. And I think, someone like Theresa May is, fantastically well known for working so hard in her constituency. Even when she was Prime Minister, she was marshalling fun runs and sporting events. And I think the current Prime Minister is very, very clear. He expects every MP to give 100% to their constituency. And it is possible to work full-time as an MP and to do other things. I do night shifts and weekends so that I don't impact on my constituency work. But I think it is important that MPs do have come from the real world, and that sometimes will mean that they do have jobs outside of Parliament.
I guess there's kind of two sort of concerns people may have. The first one about whether or not MPs are really focused on their number one job, which is being an MP. And I think you kind of touched on it there. I guess the second one is that these companies are indirectly buying influence in Parliament.
Well, what I would say, sometimes I do take the view that sometimes it's always portrayed that MPs are on the make. You know how long hours MPs work. It's a 7-day a week job. We work long into the night many times a week, not just in Parliament, but in our own constituencies. This week I've worked, 7 days a week. I'll be working 7 days a week this week as well. So it is a very, very long, unsocial job. And I just sometimes think it's important that we also reflect the good work that MPs do, as well as some of the concerns. Absolutely, that's why the transparency rules were brought in, so that any donation, any income is there for everyone to see. And then constituents can make their own minds up about whether their constituency MP is working hard for them.
OK. Well, let's have a look now, shall we, at the NHS with your kind of Health Minister hat. We touched on it a bit with your work at the Royal Marsden. It feels to me like a lot of people might be genuinely quite frightened right now about the state of the health service. I mean, we can just take a look at this graph. This shows the number of ambulances waiting longer than an hour to hand over to patients. So we know what that means. That's ambulances backed up outside hospitals with people inside that can't get a bed. It's concerning. The red line at the top is this current year. And you can see it's far higher than at any point during the pandemic. I mean, is this a health service that's in crisis?
Well, winter is always a difficult time. You know, my 25 years of nursing,
But we can see the comparison to other winters here. It feels an exceptional winter.
It is an exceptional winter. And I was just about to say that, you know, I've worked in normal winters when we've had ambulances queuing and declared critical incidents at the A&E that I worked at. But this is a different year. We're seeing a twindemic of both COVID and flu. So we're seeing, even compared to in the last decade, the most flu admissions that we've seen. There's nearly over 5,000 people in hospital at the moment with flu, over 6,000 in hospital with COVID, and many of those are over 65 with lots of comorbidities, which means they're much more unwell in hospital. And that shows you the scale of the numbers that we wouldn't normally see even in a winter when we have normal winter pressures. And staff are also facing those pressures. We have around 60,000 staff members in the NHS off sick in any one day at the moment because they too get respiratory illnesses, COVID, flu. And so that's also having an impact on services. So this is a very, very difficult winter, even compared to most usual ones.
I mean, our next guest, who we'll hear from in a moment, Dr. Adrian Boyle, President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, he believes there are around 300 to 500 unnecessary deaths every week because of delays in emergency care. Do you accept people are dying because of delays?
Well, we know that this is a difficult winter. We know there are excess deaths for a number of reasons. You know, the Chief Medical Officer has outlined
delays in
some of those. I don't recognise the figure that you've quoted there, but what I can say is that we are working really, really hard to get people into hospital. We know that around 13,000 people are in hospital in any one day that shouldn't be. That is a shifting group of people. That's not the same 13,000 every single day. If you look at December, we got 8,000 of those patients out of hospital with care packages either to home or to care homes or to other settings. And yet the next day, another group of patients are admitted really unwell with COVID, with flu, with respiratory illnesses. And they are often complex patients who, again, will take time to discharge. That's why the Prime Minister held the forum yesterday with a range of health professionals to see what more we can do. We've given 500 million this winter to get social care packages in place, to get people out of hospital, because that's the number one reason why ambulances are stuck at the doors of A&Es, because they can't unload their patients, because A&Es can't discharge their patients to the wards. So that's why we're focusing on social care.
You know, when I interview people who work in the health service, I think there's a bit of a frustration, frankly, at the government trying to say that this is just because of COVID, it's just because of an exceptional flu year. And they say it's actually because of underinvestment in the health service that goes back for years. And I just want to have a look at this. This is a funding chart, and it shows the annual changes in health spending. And you can really see that from when the Conservatives came into power in 2010, there has been a queer squeeze in funding for the health service. I mean, you're a nurse, you obviously care deeply about the NHS. Do you understand why people might be, you know, angry, I guess?
Well, you've missed off a couple of years there. So
to be fair, it's not been missed off. This is where it ends, right?
Well, no. So we've increased by 11% the funding in the last couple of years.
Do you accept that since 2010, between 2010 and 2020, there was a squeeze in funding for the health service that people are now saying in the health service this is directly related to a shortage of beds, a shortage of doctors, and the delays we're seeing now?
What I would say is that, and the Institute of Fiscal Studies have highlighted that, and they're not exactly friends of the government, that there's record levels of investment. There is an 11% increase in funding, which is missing off your chart. That has meant that we're opening up 7,000 new beds in the NHS. It does mean we're recruiting over 10,000 more nurses, which are in place now.
So are you having to make up now for underinvestment under previous Conservatives?
We are investing in record levels of funding, not just for the NHS, but also for social care. And these issues that you see around ambulances queuing up, beds not being available, they're in all four devolved nations. Whether it's Labour, who are running the NHS in Wales, are facing exactly the same pressures, and sometimes their performance in certain indicators are worse than in England. The UK government just runs the health service in England. The SNP in Scotland are facing exactly the same pressures. And it's not just within the UK. If you look at other countries, Ireland, Italy, Spain,
Okay, well,
Germany.
let's look at some other countries, shall we? Let's look at some other countries, because I think we can also show... here we go. This is hospital beds per 100,000 people. The red line in the middle is the average, and then you have to go all the way down. Only Sweden is lower than the UK. So if you're looking at international comparison on hospital beds, we're doing pretty poorly. So, yeah, again, you're looking at 2020 data. In the last 2 years,
latest available. We're opening up 7,000 new beds within the NHS. We have opened already over 90 surgical hubs, which is tackling our surgical backlog of 7 million people. We've cleared almost completely...
You've been in power for 13 years.
But we've cleared almost completely the people waiting for 2 years or more for their surgical waiting list. We're on track to meet those waiting 18 months by April, and then we'll be focusing on those waiting for a year. So, we need to look at the most up-to-date figures. 7,000 extra beds will make a huge difference to the NHS. OK,
let's talk about strikes, shall we? Because the Prime Minister has invited union leaders to have what he calls grown-up, honest talks tomorrow. There are going to be these conversations with their representative departments. Is the Health Secretary prepared to budge when it comes to pay?
So the Health Secretary has invited the unions to meet with him this week as part of this initiative, and it is to talk about both pay and conditions. He's already met with the RCO.
We'll talk about pay, because that's a shift. It feels like before we were talking about conditions. Now the government is prepared to move on pay.
Well, we want to talk about pay, the settlement for this year, because the government is about to submit evidence to the independent pay review body for the pay award for this year. And I think it's really important to have those discussions with the unions about what's realistic, but also what they're looking for as well, so that we can send the most robust information and evidence to the independent pay review body. So
that
pay is on the table.
That's a clear change, isn't it? Because previously you were saying that it was conditions that were on the table, and now it's pay and conditions. Well,
I think the difference is we are now looking at this year's pay award, and we want to make fast progress on that, and we want to be able to submit evidence to the pay review bodies that the unions will also be submitting their evidence too, so that when the award is made, that there should be hopefully a consensus around what's awarded. So we're not looking at going back at pay awards. We're really focused on the pay awards for this year.
OK. And now, just finally, I want to talk to you with your Women and Inequalities hat on, because the Scottish Government has passed new legislation to introduce self-identification system for people who want to change gender. Do you welcome that, or do you have concerns?
Well, I know the Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, who's responsible overall for this area, has some concerns and has written to the Scottish Government. And I know that they are looking at that at the moment. We do have some concerns. Obviously, we want to make sure that for those people who want to transition, we're improving the process and speeding up what's quite a clunky process at the moment. But we want to protect women's rights as well, and we have some concerns. And that's why Kemi has written to the Scottish Government and is reviewing that at the moment.
I just want to know how far you're willing to go if you do have those concerns, because immediately after the vote, the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack, said the UK government had the concerns, as you in particular over what he describes as safety issues for women and children. And then he went on to say, we will look closely at that and also the ramifications of the 2010 Equality Act and other UK-wide legislation in the coming weeks, up to and including a Section 35 order stopping the bill going for royal assent. So are you genuinely considering blocking this bill in Westminster?
Well, that'll be a matter for Cabinet. And as you say, the Scottish Secretary and Kemi Badenoch, who's the Equalities Secretary, are looking at that and having discussions. The Conservatives were the only party that voted against that legislation. We do have concerns, but that will be a matter that will be discussed at Cabinet before the final decision is taken.
OK, but on the table then?
Well, both the Scottish Secretary and the Equality Secretary have indicated that.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today, Maria Caulfield there. You are watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Busy show for us this morning. Lots on the NHS and also, of course, on our Westminster Accounts project looking at money in the political system. Well, with that in mind, we can talk now to our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who can talk us through a reaction to interviews and his reports at the top of the show. Great to have you on the programme. In the studio for once, Sam, as well. Always a pleasure. So first, just bring us up, what exactly have you been doing?
I mean, to be honest, Sophie, this has been quite an enormous project. It's taken about 7 months, more than 30 people across 2 different organisations, all to try and just to bring a bit more transparency, shine a bit more of a light on the way that money works in our politics when it comes to earnings, when it comes to donations, just to understand a bit better what's going on. And I'm very struck that both of the guests that you had this morning, immediately, neither of them looked desperately delighted that we'd done this work, because they said that everything is already out there. It's all declared, it's all transparent already. And our view, I think, is up to a point Lord Copper. Because although, yes, MPs do declare their outside earnings and their gifts and their donations on the Parliament website, it's rather hard to get to the bottom of actually what's going on and to compare one MP with another. So this morning, Sky News, in association with our media partners, Tortoise Media, have done, as it were, three things. First of all, we have taken all of those public bits of information and turned them into a giant spreadsheet, effectively. We've taken that register of members' financial interest, which is on the Parliament website, and turned it into one document. So we've effectively assigned an earnings figure, a donations figure, for each MP. They're not desperately going to like that, but that's what we've done this morning. The second thing that we've done is that we are putting that in the public domain. So it's not only for us, you at home can look at it, you can go onto the Sky News app, the Sky News website, and there you will be able to access the tool at the heart of the Westminster Accounts. And the third thing we've done is a few days' worth. We've been looking at this information. We've done days' worth of journalism beginning today.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it has taken months, as you say. You had a colossal amount of information to look through. And I know that your producer, Tom Larkin, our partners at Tortoise have spent a long time going through all of this. So what stand out then? What have you found that's interesting?
So because you've put it in a spreadsheet, because all this information is now sortable, you effectively create a series of leaderboards, top 10s, top 100s. And again, MPs do not like this. But every day we're going to look effectively at a different leaderboard for a different aspect of how money works in politics. And today we were looking at outside earnings, and you saw that chart that for the first time ever you've been able to do about the scale of outside earnings in this Parliament, from the highest, Theresa May, downwards. And the purpose of that, from where we sit, is not to say that second jobs are good or bad. There are arguments on both sides, not to say that money in politics is good or bad.
And we heard Maria Caulfield, for example, talking about her work as a nurse.
It is simply to say we want to understand and we want to be able to compare in order so that us, constituents, viewers, voters, can get a better understanding of what's going on. And what was interesting, I think, actually, and this really came out in your interview with the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, is that MPs are often more comfortable talking about the big picture than when it gets to specifics. And the highest outside earning Labour MP is David Lammy, who sits at Keir Starmer's right hand on that top table. And you put to him a whole load of specifics about quite considerable media work, but also speeches and training that he does in the roles that he's had in the shadow cabinet. And I just thought it was very stark that I didn't hear from Keir Starmer a definitive ruling whether he thought that that work was right or wrong, even though he himself, as Labour leader, has made a huge amount of political capital essentially saying we have to ban second jobs with a rider, with certain exemptions. He couldn't say whether he thought what David Lammy did should or shouldn't be an exemption. A little bit uncomfortable there. And it's those specific questions that really bring, I think, into sharp focus when you look at the data in this way. That's one of the reasons that we've done the Westminster Accounts, and there will be more different elements of money in politics in the days to come.
Look forward to seeing what else you've got up your sleeve. Sam, thanks very much for coming into the studio and explaining that to us. Well, it feels like we've gone through the political arguments from both major parties on Westminster Accounts, but also the NHS this morning. The other huge issue that, of course, is impacting all of us and our families. And we can now hear from the very front line of the health service, emergency departments where those in greatest danger are taken seem to be on the brink. Huge waits for care, sick people on trolleys in corridors, ambulance waiting hours, critical incidents declared. And the Royal College of Emergency Medicine says that hundreds of people could be dying each week because of the state of the service. Well, its president and a serving consultant in an emergency department, Dr. Adrian Boyle, was in Downing Street yesterday meeting the Prime Minister. He joins us now. It's a real pleasure to have you on the programme, so thank you for coming in. We mentioned it there. You went into number 10 and you spoke to the Prime Ministers, among others, about the state of the NHS. I think you can see the picture of you standing on the gates of Downing Street. How was the meeting?
So we're really pleased that it's been acknowledged at the highest level, and it's pleased that we recognise there's a crisis, because there is a crisis in emergency medicine. We know, and this crisis is much worse. You know, every winter we seem to go through this thing. There's another A&E crisis, but it's important to recognise that what's going on at the moment is much worse. And the graphs that you were putting up beforehand showed that.
Yeah.
And the visible markers are ambulances waiting outside hospitals. But that is only a visible marker of the whole system being under stress. And what we're seeing is if you go into the emergency department, you'll see that people are being looked after in inappropriate areas with long waits to be admitted. And if you go onto the wards, they're full. And fundamentally, the big problem we've got is, as you showed, that we don't have enough beds. Our hospitals are too full for us to do the jobs that we need them to do.
It's interesting because you mentioned there about how, look, we talk about winter crises all the time, but this is different. And I have to say, you know, I've been doing this job for some years. I've spoken to a lot of people working in the health service at this time, and it feels quite different now. I mean, frankly, you know, you guys seem quite frightened. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, it's important that people realise that if they think they need to seek help, they do seek help. And one of the anxieties that we have about all the fuss that's going on at the moment is that people who are will sit at home when really they should be seeking help. That's really important. But at the same time, pretty much everyone I spoke to, they will say, I've never seen it as bad as this.
Not even during the height of the COVID pandemic?
So in a very, very different way. Yes, COVID was an extraordinary time, but all sorts of things went over it. This feels worse because there's so many bit strands to it, and it's so difficult. And the long waits that we've got are what are so dangerous and what we're so worried about.
And I mean, I guess the biggest thing people worry about is safety, about lives, right? And you believe that lives are being lost because of delays?
It's not just belief. So there's some scientific evidence to back us up with papers that have been published in scientific journals. Everybody who's looked at this has always found that when you start getting long waits in emergency departments, you see an increase in mortality. So there's reasonable scientific data to support this. But not only that, we've also got separate analyses where people have looked at ONS data and have suggested that the increase that we've seen in excess mortality through this year, and there will be lots of factors at play, it's not one single thing, but there will be lots of factors, it's entirely plausible. And it shows this. So we think that problems accessing urgent and emergency care, whether calling an ambulance, waiting a long time for that, being anxious about going to hospital, or the long waits in emergency departments will be contributing to about a third or a quarter of all this excess mortality.
And you believe that's 300 to 500 people a week?
Yeah, I mean, it will vary. But in a way, actually, the number doesn't matter.
No.
You know, it's actually about what we do about it.
Yeah.
And it shows that there's a problem that needs fixing.
OK, and just before we get on to what we should do, because I am very keen to get your view on that, you know, when you talk to ministers and the government, they talk about COVID an awful lot, and they say, look, this is because of COVID, because the pressures we had during COVID, because of people delaying, you know, getting appointments, etc. Is that true, or do these problems go back longer? Oh,
The problems go back way longer. You know, if you look at performance indicators where we've been having problems, COVID absolutely is yet an additional thing, and it's taking a lot of disruption onto hospitals. But the problems that were causing this go back 2015. You know, we knew that this was a problem before. But if you go back before 2015, we did not have problems with ambulance handover delays. We did not have very often people spending more than 12 hours in emergency departments.
And is that underinvestment?
So it's a variety of things. Fundamentally, the big problem is that our hospitals are too full. And you put up that graph of not having enough beds, but also we're not using those beds properly. And actually, in terms of what we do with our beds, we need to make sure we're using those beds absolutely as efficiently and properly as possible. Which
I know part of that, of course, is social care. Keir Starmer also talks on the programme today about using more capacity in the private sector. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think we're in a state of crisis at the moment, and anything we can do to reduce occupancy within hospitals is the right thing to do. It feels like an expensive way to try and get ourselves out of a pickle, and I think long-term we've got to look at how we actually stop this happening again. And that means actually getting to probably a more cost-effective way to try and do this by reforming the way we do social care in this country.
I'm interested to know your thoughts on what needs to happen in the short term, but also in the long term. What do you think needs to be done?
So
and it's a big question, so apologies.
You know, a single answer isn't going to cover everything.
Sure.
But fundamentally, the thing we need to do is reduce the occupancy in our hospitals, and that means having more hospital beds and using those beds better. So fundamentally, that's the big problem. That requires investment. That means also it's not just beds, but it's the workforce to look after them. And we do need to expand our workforce, and that's right across the patch.
The government did announce more money for the NHS in November. Maria Caulfield was talking about that, an extra £3.3 billion in each of the next 2 years. And I guess some would argue that, it's not just about money, it's not just about putting more and more money into the NHS, it's about reform too, otherwise the money effectively is wasted. Do you think that's true?
I think that's fair. I mean, the NHS is an enormous organisation, and there are always things that we can do differently and think innovatively about how we do this. And I think that's a fair challenge that we need to do it. But repairing something that's broken costs a lot of money.
So more money is part of the issue, but reform too?
Yes, but you're dealing with something that's fundamentally just very, very fragile and broken, and that takes a lot of work. And, short-term big payments to try and buy aren't the way to do it. We actually need sustained, predictable funding so we can use that well, rather than just, and that means things like capital funding and actually building capacity, not just on short-term salary fixes.
And just looking forward, I know you don't want to talk directly about strikes, which I understand. There are meetings going on tomorrow. Are strikes also having an impact on the safe running of the NHS?
Well, we need to have a sense of perspective. We've been in trouble for the last year. We had 3 strike days in December. We're only having 4 strike days. Yes, they're disruptive. Yes, they're difficult. But you've got a much bigger picture of terrible working conditions that have been going on before.
OK, thank you very much indeed. It's been really interesting having you on the show, so we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. What a show, some really important issues discussed today. In a moment after the break, we're going to be running through today's interviews and seeing what we learned with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We'll also have a special edition of the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast. Should be available around lunchtime, so check that out too. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. See you in a few moments. Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge, The Take, where we take a moment and look back at this morning's interviews with some analysis from Sky's Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's here in person today, just in case you thought he was just a mirage on the screen in most weeks. He is here in person because, of course, he's also launching this special programme to start 2023. The Sky News investigation, Sky News and Tortoise, we should say, into the money that MPs get from donations, gifts and outside earnings. It's been 10 months in the making. We also, of course, had some big interviews, and not least with the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, that we are going to be playing you in this, until 10 a.m. when the rest of the news kicks into gear. So let's start off, shall we, with Westminster Accounts. Sam, just explain what's the thinking about it and what did you make of the reaction this morning?
Well, let's start with what it is. Every politician will tell you that the subject of money in politics is a subject that is completely above board because everything that they have to do must be declared and declared publicly, and that anybody can go and look at whether it's earnings, whether it's donations, whether it's gifts, all that information is out there. It's actually in quite a lot of different places in successive editions of the Register of Members' Interests, which is a document on the Parliament website, or perhaps some of it from the Electoral Commission, who collates the information about money that comes directly to the political parties as opposed to individual MPs. So you've got a lot of documents and disclosure in a lot of different ways.
So realistically, what you're saying is, if you're a normal person, wading through all these different registers, documents, looking at your MP, most people are just not going to do it.
I think that's fair to say. So what we've done is we've drawn it all together, and we've done something that is going to be quite controversial. MPs aren't going to like it. I can tell you from my phone, MPs already don't like it. We have essentially put a number on a lot of things that MPs have done. We've put a number on how much, in terms of outside earnings, they have made since December 2019, the date of the last general election. We've done the same for donations. We've looked at donors. We've looked at some outside interest groups and how they work together with parliamentarians. And now, turning the Register of Members' Financial Interests into a spreadsheet has been a hell of a task. It's 30 people, 7 months. This is because the Register of Members' Interests feels like an incredibly dated document. MPs sitting there writing entries almost as if by quill pen, where they put what they've earned, how they've done it, in some cases where they've given the money onto, in some cases not. But what that does, and that context is interesting and important and useful and still in the public domain, it won't take it away, but it makes it very hard to compare one MP with another. And that goes to the nub of it. That goes to the nub of where things might get a little bit spicy, because what we've done is assigned a single figure and then compared MPs on a like-for-like basis. Now, MPs will tell you the information was out there and there's lots of context around why they do what they do, and that's all in the register too, which is fair, but we think it is fair to be able to look at who's making the largest amount of money in outside earnings, who is getting the largest donations, just in order to have a greater insight into the way that money works in politics. The bigger sums are inevitably going to be more interesting.
Right, on that point, let's listen a bit to some of the reaction that we had on the show to the project that Sam's been talking about. So Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was on the programme. I started by getting his reaction overall to the Westminster Accounts project. Let's have a listen.
Transparency is a good thing. I think that you've obviously pulled together a lot of information there, made it publicly available. I think it was all in the public domain because it's all been declared according to... We've got strong rules, as you know. I think we've got some of the strongest rules in terms of what we have to declare. But, you know, the more transparency, the better, so that everybody can see exactly what has been declared and ask whatever questions they want to about it.
Well, there you go. He's welcoming it in general. You talked there about people being more happy to talk about the general than the specifics.
Yeah, I thought that in the scale of welcomings, that was probably muted medium. He says transparency is a good thing. More transparency is always a good thing. I'm quite struck listening to that, how there was possibly a little more defence of the status quo than an embrace of change. And that matters politically, because it's Keir Starmer who has made one, as a defining issue, really, the subject of change when it comes to the way that Westminster works. He wants to ban second jobs.
Second jobs.
And he made a big virtue of it at a press conference in November 2021. That was off the back of the Owen Paterson scandal, Tory, who was found guilty for lobbying for cash. And he did that. But the thing is that it's a slightly longer sentence than that. There's a rider with very limited exceptions. And we're asking the question this morning in the film that you played at the start of your show, whether David Lammy qualifies for those limited exceptions, because he does radio work, he does other speeches and training, and is the highest, has the highest outside earnings of any MP. And what I thought was fascinating was quite how Keir Starmer responded when you asked him whether or not he agreed that this work was one of those limited exceptions.
Yeah, we should have a little play of that, shouldn't we? Let's listen first, shall we, to what happened when I specifically talked to Keir Starmer about David Lammy.
What I was proposing was a system for all MPs, that we should ban second jobs. There's a discussion about what exemptions there should be. I think David, for example, does a lot of media work, and I think media work and writing books is all part of the political process. But there's a discussion to be had. What I was urging was for the whole House of Commons to agree new rules, because I do think that we should get rid of second jobs, with some exceptions. Some people have jobs where they need to top up their skills. And I do think if you write a political book or, you know...
As you have yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That may be grounds for an exemption.
You see, this is the key, isn't it, Sam? You know, he's saying that we should ban second jobs. You know, that it almost felt like there was a full stop at the end of that sentence when he announced it in the wake of the Owen Paterson scandal. Now he's talking about exceptions. And when I asked him about exemptions specifically, the one he gave was political books. And I have to say, it feels to me like that's the easiest one in the book to give, right?
Because he's writing one.
Particularly, he's got to give that one because he's writing one as well. But the more controversial stuff is things that he's not just being specific on, right?
That's right. And if you listen closely to the way that Keir Starmer handled your question, he effectively said it was for the House of Commons to decide the exact rules. Well, given that he was the person that said there should be a ban on second jobs with limited exemptions, I might have thought that Keir Starmer could pronounce what side of the line he felt that David Lammy's outside activities fall on, given that David Lammy is Shadow Foreign Secretary. I have to say, one of the activities people might be quite relaxed about, and is David Lammy's LBC job. I'd never ever tell anyone not to watch Sky News permanently, but David Lammy, I think, is going to be on LBC maybe as soon as 15 minutes' time. Viewers give him a call.
To be fair, I thought the defence that you played in your film, actually, that David Lammy gave on LBC previously, was actually quite compelling, you know.
And for me, whether it's this topic or whether it's almost anything that we've covered in the Westminster Accounts, I have no view on whether, I don't think money in politics is a bad thing. It's just a feature of life. We have no view on whether second jobs are a good or a bad thing. We just want to understand how it works. But there is a thing that has struck me through this, which is where politicians are prepared to engage and explain and effectively help take voters into understanding what's going on, particularly with money, that's a good thing for transparency. And where you have people like Theresa May, where you try and you try and you try and you try and you try to contact them, and you fail, and they know we're doing this, and we keep phoning them, and they never answer. I think that's where there are questions.
And talking about people who know we're doing this and answer questions, let's move on to Maria Caulfield, shall we? Because she knew we were going to ask about it. We pulled up her accounts on the screen, and we were able to have a conversation going through each one where she explained what they were and why she was doing it and how much she earned. People will have their own views, as you say, about money in politics, but the transparency has got to be a good thing. Let's have a little listen, shall we, to Maria Caulfield. Part of the money that she earns is her work as a nurse. Let's listen.
But I think, what was important during the expenses scandal was to try and end professional politicians just being the only route into being an MP. And so you are seeing people coming into Westminster with outside interests. I'm a nurse, I still work as a nurse, I declare those earnings on my website. And then, cross-party, we have doctors who work in the Labour Party, on our side in the Conservative Party. And I think it's important that people are able to keep their interests in that sort of field going. It certainly helps me in terms of my work as a local constituency MP, but also as a health minister to really see what's happening on the ground.
What do you make of the Maria Caulfield interview?
So Maria Caulfield explained, I thought, very eloquently why she did what she did and mounted a defence of why actually outside activities are perfectly reasonable in some cases. And actually, I think on the case of being a nurse, Labour's Keir Starmer would agree the Labour exemptions to the second job ban that we know about are nurses, doctors, members of the armed services, and then people who write books and do media appearances. And I think there'll be a cross-party consensus on that. But that's not the whole story. Yeah. It is people making large money from outside organisations, particularly from speeches and from some forms of consultancy. It's important to say Parliament has already in the last few weeks decided to tighten its rules. There are certain types of parliamentary advisory roles that are no longer going to be possible, maybe hitting the second jobs of up to 30 MPs. So some reforms are underway, but I think it's the difficult questions are the ones that remain. Maria Caulfield talking about the expenses scandal. This is not the expenses scandal. In fact, I don't think that there is a scandal. We haven't gone looking for a scandal, and nor have we found one in the reporting this week. All we are doing is highlighting what we don't know, what we do know, and then discovering what we don't, and are just asking why not.
What should we be expecting in the days ahead?
Well,
not to give away any secrets, obviously.
Well, our approach has been to look at leaderboards, top 10s, top 100s, so we're going to keep doing that. But it's no secret what the public, what the Westminster Accounts, what the documents, what the information tells us. It tells us not only about earnings, which we've done today, it tells us about donations, it tells us about who's getting the money, and it tells us about a little bit about these informal groups that MPs have in Parliament, all party groups, that can be supported by outside organisations, and we're looking a little bit at that. So those are the areas. For me, as I say, it is what we discover, but it is also what we found that we couldn't discover that matters. And it's a conversation that's beginning. There will be a lot of angry MPs out there today, but if we can contribute to the greater public understanding of how money works in politics so they don't feel attacked the moment that the subject comes up, then that benefits everybody.
My ears pricked up, I have to say, when you said that you are already getting the sense that MPs are not very happy with this project.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised about it, and I regret that they feel that way, but would defend what we have done. And I think that
Their concern is that we both trivialise and remove the context of a lot of their money, of their declarations, and in some way make it look like they're doing a bad thing. But I come back to the point that if there is no problem with money being in our political system, then that subject would be better neutered by coming out and talking about why not. The most impressive MPs through the project that we have done have been the ones willing to engage. They can make an argument, and in many cases they are quite compelling, where MPs just want to duck and hide and sort of have a go back. That, I think, is where the public don't end up understanding and start thinking that things are shady. So yes, come out, criticise us.
We're used to that as journalists,
we
right?
are used to that as journalists.
We've got thick skins.
But what that is doing is engaging in a discussion about how it works. And that's a good thing, and that's what we're looking to do.
Fascinating, and I'm going to be watching your other reports with interest as the week goes on. While we've got you, it is the first show of 2023. It's going to be a big year, isn't it? We had, big speeches this week, both from Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. I'm just interested in some of your kind of political predictions, I guess. What are we going to see in the year ahead? And I know you've got to take your head out of this and put it somewhere else, so apologies.
So in a very, very rapid gear change, there's an enormous amount of work, both for Rishi Sunak and for Keir Starmer, to do this year. I mean, I feel like the public haven't quite drawn breath after last year, which was in a year like nobody has seen in their lifetimes when it comes to British politics. And the dust hasn't quite settled. But we have two... we have a Prime Minister and a credible prime ministerial contender. I think that Keir Starmer needs to set out his vision in a way that the public really engage with and decide that they like. He is clearly very far ahead in the polls. The question is, has he sealed the deal? With Rishi Sunak, he's got two tasks. He's got to convince the public that he's more than a temporary managerial frontman. But also he's got a difficult task on his hand. He's got to keep his party together. Because after the last 7 years, really, the Conservative Party is in a difficult and fractured state. A lot of stories in the papers this morning about Boris Johnson. Is he weighing a comeback? There are deep divisions inside the Conservative Party. Will Boris Johnson be the subject of this standards inquiry, the televised trial of Boris Johnson? Where they have to decide whether he lied. Will Rishi Sunak do a deal on Northern Ireland that absolutely explodes the opinion of Brexiteer members who fear that he's doing a deal that ties us too close to the European Union? There are real landmines for him in the coming months. Don't rule out a general election this year, because it might be that those forces just aren't able to be controlled.
You said that Keir Starmer needs to seal the deal to prove that he can be the next Prime Minister. It's been a big week this week for him. He had his big speech. He's done the interview this morning on the programme. Do you think he's edged closer to sealing the deal, or do you think we see more of the same?
I think that there's been a gear change from Keir Starmer ever since sort of September. He's got a new speechwriter. There's a new sense of confidence. It's interesting what happens when it makes everything easier. When you're 20 points behind, everything feels more difficult. And that's the world that Keir Starmer is now operating in. He looks like a big figure on the domestic political stage. When you dig into the numbers on the polling, what is happening a bit is that people are losing some faith in the Conservative Party. A lot of those ex-Tory voters are not yet Labour voters. It's that transition that he's got to manage and hold and seal when it comes to the next general election. So there is a job of work to be done.
It's really interesting. And finally, the NHS, because I have to say, whenever I speak to people like, Adrian, Boyle on the programme, it's quite frightening, because they look frightened themselves.
So the NHS is one of those political issues where people make up their own mind based on their own experience. Almost every voter has or knows someone who is engaged with the health system, and it isn't a problem you can spin your way out of, and that's what Rishi Sunak is going to find. Either his solutions make it better, or people decide that it hasn't worked.
Fascinating to talk, as always. I hope the rest of the day goes well, the rest of the week. You need to lie down in a dark room after it, I'm sure. Thanks very much, Sam Coates. Quick reminder, our weekly podcast starts again today. There's highlights of our interviews, a bit of post-match analysis, and some insight into how we put the programme together. Today will be with myself, Scott Beasley, our editor, and Sam Coates. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, search for Sophy Ridge On Sunday. It will be available again later today. In the meantime, of course, we should be seeing you on Wednesday. The First to Take will be back at 9 p.m. on Wednesday. Great to be back. Have a lovely rest of your Sunday.